Nicola Sturgeon has become a political annoyance over her campaign for a second referendum on Scottish independence, with parts of Scotland fed up with her persistent demands, a think tank chief has claimed. Nicola Sturgeon is continuing to ramp up her calls for another vote on Scottish independence to take place as soon as this year, despite the country voting to remain in the UK during the referendum in 2014 by a clear margin of 55% to 45%. The SNP made it explicitly clear to the Scottish people in the lead-up to the vote more than 5 years ago it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity for them. But Ms. Sturgeon has reignited her calls for another referendum in recent weeks, particularly following Brexit, which saw Scotland vote to remain in the European Union in 2016 by a clear margin of 62% to 38%. Scotland's ruling party has continued to launch scathing attacks against Boris Johnson over his continued rejections of a second referendum, with Ms. Sturgeon raging the UK's departure from the EU has happened against the wishes of the Scottish people. But political experts have lashed out at the First Minister, claiming the Scottish public are now tiring of her calls for Scottish independence and that the SNP should concentrate on repairing matters closer to home. Patrick Sullivan, founder and chief executive of Westminster think tank Parliament Street, told Express.co.uk, "We have already had a vote on Scottish independence. Perhaps those now advocating a loser's vote were asleep when the original one took place. The Scottish people, as proven from the last referendum, know which side their bread is buttered." Sturgeon is slowly but surely becoming a political annoyance to many. Alistair Jones, principal politics lecturer at De Montfort University in Leicester, claimed many Scottish people are now a little fed up with having to always revisit the issue. But he believes the disastrous result for the Scottish Conservatives in December's general election, which saw them lose 7 of their 13 seats, actually demonstrates the waning enthusiasm for independence. Mr. Jones told Express.co.uk, "Parts of the Scottish population are becoming a little fed up with the revisiting of a referendum." During the general election campaign, some Tory campaigners expressed enthusiasm for Nicola Sturgeon's repeated calls for another referendum as they saw more voters turn towards them. The results, however, suggested otherwise. SNP support was up. The Conservatives came a distant second, losing half their seats and their vote dropped to about 25% of the total Scottish vote. Elliot Wilson, a former clerk of the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Committee and now head of research at the Right Angles think tank, suggested recent polls showing a lack of enthusiasm for independence shows only hardcore nationalists are still determined to force the issue. A YouGov poll on January 30 of 1,039 Scottish people aged 16 and over found 51% think Scotland should be an independent country. But more than half, 56%, are against an independence referendum being held this year, with just 34% in support. There is also opposition to holding one next year after the Scottish Parliament elections, even if the SNP wins a majority of the seats. Nearly half, 46%, oppose this, while 41% are in support of it. Mr. Wilson said, the SNP made it very clear in 2014 that the referendum, which they hoped would produce a result in favour of independence, was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The reality of defeat has set in and, understandably, they want another go. It is possible, perhaps likely, the electorate has moved on and it is only hardcore nationalists who are still agitating to revisit the issue of independence. Ben Harris-Quinney, chairman of the Bow Group think tank, also believes there is not enough support from the Scottish public to force through another referendum. He claimed this means the SNP only averagely represent a minority view in Scotland and that most people still don't want to leave the UK. Mr. Harris-Quinney told Express.co.uk, the SNP claimed to speak for Scotland, but we shouldn't forget that they lost the independence referendum by a clear margin. The best polls for independence have shown support at a maximum of 50%, with most showing the majority still wanting to be part of the UK. The SNP therefore averagely represent a minority view in Scotland, albeit a significant one. The first-past-the-post electoral system often presents skewed results which aren't necessarily representative of what most people think, and despite the SNP victory, most people still don't want to leave the UK. Wyn Grant, politics professor at Warwick University, believes Scottish people want the issue of independence shelved until after the Holyrood elections in 2021, with an SNP and Green win straightening the case for. Scottish Conservative MP for Banff and Buchan David Duguid added, "In my constituency of Banff and Buchan, people have become increasingly frustrated with Nicola Sturgeon and her obsession with independence. I think that the majority of Scots just want to move on from the constitutional division of the last 10 years and focus on the things that matter, on fixing problems in our health service, improving schools and growing our economy."